Next up on the show, we have Mark Taylor-Canfield, a journalist with Free Speech Radio News out of Seattle. He joins us today to talk about the grand jury resistors. Thank you for joining Occupy Radio tonight, Mark.
Hey, always good to be with you, reporting the unreported news from Seattle.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of unreported news. I'm counting on that. You called to tell me that the grand jury resistors, who we've been following here in the Pacific Northwest, one of the major unreported stories of late, is taking a turn for the good, I guess, right now. I don't even really know the story yet, and it's now about 3 or 4 days old. So what's happening there?
Kind of an interesting turn of events, because there have been a lot of activists and alternative media journalists like myself trying to get the story out, and we've been facing a major corporate media blackout on the whole issue. So except for maybe an article in the Portland Mercury, maybe one in the Oregonian, and maybe a couple in the Stranger magazine out of Seattle, there really hasn't been any coverage, although Al Jazeera called these grand jury resistors America's Pussy Riot. And it goes all the way back to July, when there were violent raids, actually, using concussion grenades by FBI special teams and SWAT teams in Seattle. They raided 2 homes, one in Portland and one in Seattle, confiscated political material, cell phone, laptop, black clothing, etc. Activities on May Day in Seattle of last year, when windows were broken at a federal appeals courthouse. The grand jury resistors were saying that basically their testimony was tangential to the investigation. They weren't being targeted for any criminal prosecution as far as the investigation was concerned, but the grand jury wanted them to testify, so they were subpoenaed, brought before the grand jury in Seattle, and basically they all refused to testify. There have been 5 subpoenas. 4 people have been jailed. 3 of them were being held in solitary confinement until last week, when Judge Richard Jones, after a request for their release by their attorneys, released them, saying that basically the statement that's available through the Stranger blog or at the Committee Against Political Repression on the WordPress site. If you go to Committee Against Political Repression, it'll take you to their website, where they've been, since the beginning of this case, posting statements by the grand jury resistors and their supporters and trying to keep people up to date, since the media doesn't do that. They have a statement from Judge Richard Jones, federal district court judge, saying that he's releasing them, not only 2 of them, Mathew Duran and Katherine Oljinek, from solitary confinement and from prison in general. So he mentioned in his ruling the psychological and physical effects of torture, or of solitary confinement, which some would consider torture, and that he was admitted that their physical and mental health had been degraded, that they had stood by their commitment not to testify because they thought that it was a political witch hunt, that this is political repression, and the National Lawyers Guild actually agreed with them. So the judge actually gave them creds in his ruling. It's a pretty strident ruling, actually, and said that although the grand jury might question their decision not to testify, you can't question their commitment to their principles. And so holding them in solitary confinement or holding them in jail at all, he saw as no advantage to the grand jury. And so he had 2 of them released. As far as I understand, and I could be corrected on this, Matty Piper is still in federal prison at SeaTac, Washington, but he has also been placed in the general population and taken out of solitary confinement. So what people need to understand is that when they say solitary confinement, what we're talking about is 23 hours a day in your cell with no contact even with any prison guards or personnel, and 1 15-minute phone call per month. That's how they've been living. Now, how do you launch a legal defense case when you can only talk to someone 15 minutes per month? So you can see that they've been languishing basically in jail without any communication with the outside world or even their own jail personnel for months.
And we still don't know why they were put in solitary, do we?
Yeah, grand juries have been used throughout the years. They've actually been used against the mob, against the mafia, and the reason that they would hold people in jail is to coerce them into testifying against their cohorts, the conspirators, fellow conspirators. So what they would do is they would take a mob boss, put them in jail, and just sit on them and try to coerce them into testifying. It doesn't tend to be that effective in most cases, and in this case, it wasn't used against any kind of organized crime. It was used against activists. And so that was part of the issue here, was freedom of speech, freedom of affiliation, freedom of assembly. if the government can come in and confiscate your material and hold you as a material witness or as or try to coerce you into testifying by putting you in solitary confinement, then you have to question the process. There were no criminal charges filed against the grand jury resistors. They were jailed in contempt of court. So presumably they could have been held for the entirety of the grand jury, and that could have been 18 months. As it is, I think that Mathew Duran actually was jailed originally in August. So that's September, that's 4 or 5 months. We're talking 5 months now.
Oh, I think we're 6 or
more
7
than that,
now.
yes. And then Katherine, she was subpoenaed later in the process, as she's been in for a few months. And then third person the first was died, and I believe in September. And no one really knows what the conditions of her release were. So it's all...
I've heard somebody was saying that they're concerned that she might have caved. But again, until you're in that position, I'm not willing to look down on anybody who wasn't exemplary under unreasonable circumstances.
Well, although we do have to point out that is the stance of the Committee Against Political Repression and the supporters of the grand jury resistors. That's what they have expected, and that's what all of the people that were subpoenaed said that they were going to do, was that they would refuse to testify. So in point of fact, there are many issues that we don't have any information on, because the warrants in this case have been sealed. All of the documents related to the subpoenas have been sealed by Jenny Durkin, the U.S. attorney. So we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes, but we do know that 2 people have been released from solitary, or 3 people have been released from solitary confinement, and that is the whole reason that people like myself have been trying to get the word out and report everywhere I can on the story, was just to keep them in the public eye so that they weren't forgotten about. And luckily, we've gotten at least enough alternative media support to keep the issue alive, to the point where the judge finally said, this is ridiculous and I'm going to end this nonsense. So I just think that it's a great victory. I regret the fact that they've been in jail so long, because that can have been a good thing. So, but it's good that the judge finally had the sense to say that this is just inhuman treatment. So, and as far as I know, there's still another person, Ms. Karinen, I can't remember how you pronounce her last name, Cunen. She has been subpoenaed as well. So there's a 5th person, and I don't know what the status of her case is yet, but she has also said that she would refuse to even show up at the federal grand jury. So I don't know what
she's
the status is of that.
she's basically on the run from the grand jury.
I don't know if you could say, I guess it's all up to personal interpretation, but on the run maybe not the right phrase, just because she's been public about it. She's not trying to hide. She's just refusing to cooperate.
Oh, so she's just not going into the court. She's not doing like Abby Hoffman, where he disappeared in the 70s for a while.
Not that I know of, because of course I don't know for sure, but not that I know of. My impression was that she did make a public statement on the No Political Repression website. So I don't know anything more than that. It's just that the statement that she made was that she was going to refuse to testify, and then the latest report I heard was that she just wasn't going to show up.
Okay.
So I believe in the other cases, they actually went to the federal grand jury and then refused to testify and were immediately taken to jail, or at least after a couple continuances, where in this case, I'm not sure she's actually appeared yet. And I'm not really sure what the status of the federal grand jury is at this point and what their plans are. Obviously, people are out of solitary confinement. 2 of them have been released from prison. And a lot of people questioned, from the very beginning, the whole process and why they were jailed to begin with. So that, I would say, is a victory.
We don't even know if anybody has been tried, whether they've gained any evidence to try anybody. There doesn't appear to be any other court case going on that they're using their testimony or lack of testimony in, right?
As I understand it, and I'm not an attorney, but the federal grand jury is convened to subpoena possible witnesses or people involved in some kind of criminal investigation, and so their job is to come up with enough evidence to actually put someone on trial. And you are correct. At this point, the federal grand jury has been going on since at least August, and so far the only people who have been placed in jail are people who have refused to testify, and it was stated by the federal grand jury that those people who were jailed are not the target of a criminal investigation, which is the catch-22 here, in that they're not allowed to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution, because if you're not the subject of a criminal investigation, then you can't protect yourself from incriminating yourself, since there's nothing to incriminate yourself with. See, it's a catch-22. It's a very surreal, the whole situation. I do know there's a history of this. There are some organizations that have been working really hard on this issue, and anti-war activists, green activists, all sorts of other people have been subjected to these grand juries in the past, and I know the future is of this, but one interpretation, folks have asked me in some of my other news reports as a comment, why do you think that this investigation was launched? And one way to look at it would be a sort of political response. In other words, windows got broken on May Day, city officials, federal officials said, we're going to do something about this. So it's almost as if it's a political response. I don't know if they're actually going to charge anybody with anything. I just think in the larger perspective, it came across to a lot of people as sort of a wide net that they were trying to grab people in, anyone associated with movements that use the term anarchism.
There was a net that stretched all the way to Portland.
Seattle, Olympia, and Portland. The latest subpoena was of an activist who lives in Olympia. So all three communities have been the focus of this investigation, and especially Portland for some reason. I'm not sure why, except that
the Northwest, everybody's going to Portland now.
But yeah, I'm glad that you guys are covering this, and I'm glad that at least the result of the story is getting out. It seemed like the only corporate coverage that I've seen happened after they were released, so sort of after the fact. So while these people were languishing in prison and in solitary confinement for months, no reporter worth their salt, so to speak,
stepped up to cover it. Well, you're worth your salt, but no reporter with the backing of a high circulation newspaper or TV news show stepped up to cover it.
Yeah, it was really, really frustrating for me, and I even had trouble getting foreign news agencies to cover it. And cases like this, if it's not getting coverage, then a lot of times what people like me do is we try to reach out to journalists who have access to the media, like Chris Hedges or Glenn Greenwald or someone like that. And although Chris Hedges did a really good article about Shannon McLeish and the FOIA documents about infiltration of the Occupy movement by federal police and private agencies, nobody really stepped up to take on the issue of the grand jury resistors in Seattle. And the only thing I can think about that is that also may be a political aspect of the story. If it had been this Sierra Club activist or something, you might have seen a different response. But that's just my interpretation. I did try to reach out to Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian and other foreign news agencies, and no one would touch the story. So it's really, really frustrating to me to know that there's a story that, regardless of your opinion of the story, deserves coverage, and you just find that no one's interested. It's a very strange thing to encounter as a reporter.
Well, hey, I appreciate you covering it, and I appreciate that you have been there to cover a great deal of stories that aren't getting covered, and that you are willing to bring them to us here on Occupy Radio. We had talked about maybe getting some other stories in there, but we're just not going to have time. So
yeah, I had that feeling it would probably take up most of our time.
Yeah, that's fine.
I usually just try to tie it into a larger picture here of how it's connected to the larger infiltration and surveillance of the Occupy Wall Street movement, because a couple of these activists did attend Occupy Wall Street events, and the Freedom of Information Act requests that were brought out partly through the auspices of folks at Truth Out that showed all that information. It just sort of shows how the movements can be the target of surveillance and repression, regardless of the lack of any criminal intent, involved in the people that are being persecuted. So that's just something that we need to stay on top of in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, freedom of assembly in this country, First Amendment rights.
Okay, all right. Well, I want to thank you for joining us on the show tonight, and looking forward to doing it again.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to get the information out there, and people can, like I said, go to the Stranger magazine out of Seattle has a blog about this story, and there's maybe one article at Salon, one that I wrote at Truth Out, but otherwise it's really hard information to find, so go to WordPress and look for Committee Against Political Repression if you want the latest.
Okay, I will include those in our podcast notes, and thanks again. We'll see you soon.
All right, thank you.
You're listening to Occupy Radio on 88.1 FM, KWVA, streaming at kwvaradio.org. You can podcast us at occupymediapodcast.com and search for us in iTunes under Occupy Media. That was Mark Taylor-Canfield, an independent journalist out of Seattle, covering the story of the grand jury resistors.